Hello, everybody, and good evening. My name's Don Arleth, and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. Donald Trump plans to continue to supply military aid to Kyiv after he takes office on January 20th of next year. This is according to the Financial Times, citing anonymous sources. He will also demand that Europe, in some cases, more than double military spending to 5% of GDP. And now joining me here to discuss this topic is national security expert Mark Toth. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Don.
Yes, great to have you on World Talks. Now, there's been a lot of crying wolf over Donald Trump and what he's going to do. I know we've discussed the matter several times. Compared to everything you've told me in previous editions of talks and other shows, I doubt you are that surprised at this. Is this something that European leaders have been ultimately fearing? Actually, Donald Trump is likely to take a proper course.
Right, Don, as we've discussed before, Trump, when you look at his words, you've got to separate the messaging that he's using for the American people versus what ultimately he's going to do behind closed doors in terms of negotiations with Europe. And so this is encouraging. It's what we were hopeful of. And again, no one can speak for Donald Trump. He's his own man. He's going to make these decisions. But this is what we were hopeful of seeing. And I think it's notable that not only did this report has come out and saying that he's going to continue military aid to Ukraine and at the same time demand that NATO members get up to a 5% level. It's very notable that he has not pushed back on that. You've not heard anyone coming out and saying, no, we didn't say that. We didn't commit to that. So that tells me, reading between the lines here, this is messaging that they definitely wanted to come out ahead of General Kellogg taking over as the chief envoy between Ukraine and Russia and trying to get to see whether there's a peace deal to be had or not.
Well, since the beginning of the year, Europe has been scrambling just to come up to the 2% of GDP mark, which was set by Trump in his previous term. Concerning this, I think the question now begs, can they do more? Some countries won't even make it to that 2% mark, it seems, maybe some of the smaller countries. But Germany, for instance, is struggling to get to the 2% mark, including things like road infrastructure, which is normally not included in military spending. So what's in store for a country like Germany?
In terms of Germany and the other countries that aren't there yet, in terms of the GDP spending, they've got to come to terms with reality. I mean, take Putin at his own word. This is a man who one day says he's willing to talk anytime in terms of peace negotiations. And then the next day, he's willing to say the world is at war with him, and therefore Russia is at war with the world. Just said that 2 days ago. If you look at what his own UN representative said, Andrei Buzalov, his defense minister said, he's basically saying Europe should be prepared to fight a war, in 10 years. Russia may see that NATO is a threat, and they want Russia to be prepared for that. So if we take them at their word, Europe has no choice here. This spending money is not just about achieving a percentage, but it's about achieving weapons capabilities, systems, defensive mechanisms, and the like, in order to make sure that Europe's kept safe. And that's just imperative. And I'd only add to this point that your country, Poland, has been the guiding star here. You're almost already at 5%. By some estimates, it's 4.5%. Some others say it's 4.7%, but close enough, right? Just a little bit more, and you've been able to do it. If you can do it as a growing, emerging economy, so too can Germany with its industrial base and its capacity to grow. And so do the other countries, because there are some that are lagging badly. And that includes Canada, that includes Belgium, that includes Luxembourg. They're at 1.5% or less. Not a good thing.
It seems so. It also seems that some countries are going to have to make some very important decisions, which could play an effect on their own domestic politics, having to spend more on defense and then turn around and slash certain spending, especially when you look at social spending here in the European continent. That doesn't bode well for some of these politicians.
No, it doesn't. But the reality is, if you don't have national security, ultimately you don't have social security, in the sense of that you can have all these programs, but they're not going to do you any good if your country's security is in peril. And I think that's what Europe is going to have to come to grasp with. But at the same time, I think there's economic opportunity here that a lot of Europe is missing. I mean, your country in particular, this center that's been developed in part by NATO, but taking technologies that are being learned on the battlefield in Ukraine and applying those and having a center to develop businesses around them that is located in your country is a huge opportunity for Poland, to find a way internally to pay for this added expenditure in terms of your GDP on military spending. And so there's opportunities here. Europe just has to see it. They've got to start looking at the equation differently. And just as one example, just as you were reporting on World News Tonight, just moments ago, you see the burgeoning technology of AI in terms of target identification on the battlefield. That's something that countries can be getting around, where it's basically has a dual punch. You're achieving a military capability, but you're also increasing your IT structure, infrastructure, if you will, throughout your country and your economy. So, there's better ways to look at this than just saying, oh, it's a drain on existing programs. It's also an opportunity for new revenue. And Europe, in my opinion, should be chasing it.
Yeah, new technologies, as you pointed out. Okay, well, Donald Trump has also said that the goal is 5%, but it might take a while to get there. How patient do you think he's going to be on this bridge, this gap between 2.5% and 5%?
Trump likes to aim high, and I think the messaging that we got from the Financial Times report is that he's really looking for 3.5%. He gets it probably that most countries are not going to be able to do that. Now, in terms of the smaller countries, it's not going to matter much. You're not talking about a huge amount of net dollars. But in terms of Germany, England, the bigger countries, France, that need to be carrying the weight, it's something that they need to be achieving. And again, it just comes down to their security. Do they want to be blind? Do they want to put themselves back in 1939 before Nazi Germany basically surprised the world and started attacking back after England declared war? Or do they want to be prepared for that? And that's the choice they're facing. Donald Tusk, your prime minister, just, I think within the last month or so, has said, look, you've got to be prepared. We're in a form of a next world war. Europe is at stake, and you've got to be making these decisions. So hopefully they'll get it. And yes, it's going to be painful. It's hard, but life's about choices, and they need to be making better ones in terms of their national security. That means, not just, again, I emphasize this a lot on TVP World, not just about the spending as a percentage, but the spending in terms of what it buys. Because I'll remind people, as we sit here at Christmas and we look at what Putin is doing in terms of attacking Ukrainian cities, only 20% of Europe, Western Europe, is covered by air assets. That means Putin, if he took the same kind of war to the rest of Europe, 80% since exposed. And that's not good, talking energy infrastructure, railways, and the like. So Europe has got a lot to do to catch up. And of course, the U.S. needs to be helping in that process.
Now, if we assume, let's just assume a best case scenario that the NATO countries of Europe just rapidly increase their spending to 5%, and they're expecting some kind of Russian aggression by the year 2030. If we extrapolate that out, will Europe be in the position to kind of go it alone to defend itself against this Russian aggression, while the United States focuses on East Asia, like China?
At this point, the U.S. obviously has to do it all in terms of making sure that China's not a threat, and in terms of making sure that Russia doesn't pose a threat to Europe. In my mind, the two are interconnected. So certainly, while I think Europe could, under the right circumstances, get its act together and act individually, I think what you're seeing here, what Trump is signaling, and for me, as someone that looks to the tea leaves of the journals that are currently counseling, people that have his ear, people like Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg that I just mentioned, General Jack Keane, who's been heavy on Fox lately, here in the U.S., saying that we have to look at both threats seriously, can't pivot from one to the other. I think Trump is signaling, look, we've got your back as long as you have your own back, too. And that's what he's wanting to see. And so Europe, has an opportunity to take advantage of that. But in the process, in the terms of building up to that 5% level, or if it's only 3.5%, Europe can then start to alleviate a lot of those weaknesses that are putting Europe in this position to begin with, that they're not able to do it. Because I do think we have to look at this threat 10 years out. Let's take Putin seriously at his word. He's shown that he's willing to invade neighboring countries, and so we can't just discount that. And I really do think, to harken back to Ronald Reagan times, we've got to look at the concept again of peace through strength. And the best way to avoid a future war in Europe is to make sure Europe is strong enough and ideally backed with the full force of the United States as well.
Yeah, deterrence is definitely the key. Well, we also have a couple countries like Slovakia, Hungary, Viktor Orban, Prime Minister Fico, who is actually in Moscow right now and just kissed the hand of Vladimir Putin, trying to get some kind of workaround for the transit, which is being shut off, the gas transit by Ukraine. So what if those countries just go ahead and say business as usual, we're going to spend the minimum that we can possibly on defense? With the Orban and potentially even the Fico-Trump-Orban relationship, does this even matter since they're two small countries, first of all? And, well, is Trump going to be as tough on them as he said, as he will be, for instance, on Germany?
Right. Yeah, I have a feeling Trump's going to sidestep them just because of existing relationships, especially with Orban in Hungary. He may not want to fight that fight at this point. But in terms of what Europe needs to be doing, in my opinion, both with Slovakia and with Hungary, is basically saying we're not going to put up with this. If you're going to Moscow and bending the knee to Putin, kissing the ring and the like, there's going to be consequences here. And probably the best way to do that is through the EU, not necessarily through NATO itself, but to say, look, this is just not acceptable. You can't put your economic interests ahead of the national security interests of all of the groups that form up the EU and NATO. There's got to be a change there. But also, I think there's an interesting play that Europe can do in combination with the U.S. I mean, your own great reporting just recently, I think last week, right? You were in Tbilisi. The U.S. and its NATO allies, we can turn that equation around. We can be supporting these freedom movements that are happening in Georgia that have, already peeled countries like Albania away from the CSTO. And there's opportunities to be had there. So for every move that Putin tries to make with a Fico or with an Orban, I think should be a corresponding move from the West, from NATO, to make those kind of moves in Georgia. Because you saw for yourself, you know better than I do, that there are a lot of people in Georgia that want freedom and don't want to go back to a Soviet era kind of repression.
There certainly is, and that begs the question about European leadership. We see a gap in the, political will, if you will. We've been seeing this for quite a long time. The lack of political will versus what happens when societies get frustrated and vote in far-right candidates. How can we reconcile that on the European continent?
It's going to take leadership. And I think that's why your country in particular, a lot of us are looking to Poland at this point to take that leadership role as you take on the head of the EU for the next, I think, 6 months in terms of the rotation. I may have that timing wrong. But it's important for you to take that role and to be making this message, as widely heard as possible, that Europe has to get its act together, that we can't let politics, domestic politics, negate what the real national security needs of Europe are. And that's happening in some countries. You've seen it, obviously, as we've talked about, in Slovakia and as well as in Hungary. But at the same time, there have been other countries on the flip side of that equation, Sweden and Finland, who just both recently acceded to NATO, where they're saying, no, we do get the threat. We need to be inside of NATO. So there's a lot of good messaging that can come from what we call new NATO in terms of the new countries. And I think that leadership has to come from Poland because, one, you're going to be in the driver's seat, but also you're the leading example. You're the ones that were first on the fronts in terms of supporting Ukraine. You're the ones that continue to do that. You're the ones that continue to stand strong, building up your own defenses, the defensive lines that you're creating, the missile sites that you've allowed to be built by NATO on your territory. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the research facilities. So more of that is good. And that's the best way of trying to convince politicians across the board, wherever they are ideologically, that this can't be a political fight, but it really has to be assessed from a military standpoint, because it's a military fight with Russia. It's not a political one.
Certainly. National security expert Mark Toth, thank you very much for your analysis. And as always, it's great to have you on. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure, Don. Thank you very much. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you. And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you soon.